We checked out some of the cool things in Vancouver that I don't really get a chance to go and do. I mean, like, I have the chance to do them, but I don't do them because I live here and they're...
Did you go to the Steam Clock?
I did go to the Steam Clock.
Oh my god.
The worst tourist attraction.
It's not powered by Steam.
No, it was
Downtown Vancouver.
Powered by Steam. All it does, because it doesn't keep accurate time, it just marks the passage until death.
It was also installed in like the 70s. It's not at all old, and it's powered by electricity. Like it literally the Steam is just a
totally
decoration.
Pointless.
What a lie. Steam Clock, we're on to you. Welcome to Pod Keep Our Land. It's what
Pat Carney
would have listened to. We are a show about Canadian politics, parliaments, politicians, and policies. I'm your host, Erin Rennie.
I'm Matthew Naylor.
And I'm Patrick Meehan.
And we are podcasting to you from Vancouver, British Columbia. Today is November 2nd, 2017. And on the show today, we have a lot of interesting topics. We're going to be talking about what's been going on in the news lately. We're going to get into the BCUC report on sightseeing. And then we're going to talk about NAFTA modernization. So let's talk about the news this week, guys. Lots of interesting things. One headline that caught my eye was that Pets OK BC, a new nonprofit, is circulating a petition to ban pet prohibitions in rentals in British Columbia.
So the argument against this petition, and I saw this petition first when Patrick shared it actually, is that owners should have the rights to control what goes on in their buildings and that pets cause undue damage to apartments. And I don't find that particularly compelling because, I don't know, so do people. And also, people should be able to keep their pets. That just feels right to me. So
I think it was fascinating to me was because I posted the article and it was like 100 and some odd comments. My Facebook wall tends to be a bit of a gathering point of people, and I have friends on the right and the left, and sometimes it gets heated. But I found it really fascinating was that there were very, very few people that were really truly defending the landlord's, pseudo right to say no to these things. And that was really neat to me. There were people that came on that are landlords who said that, they usually say pets are negotiable because then they can turn around and decide. But they also, several people that are landlords commented that they feel that pet owners are actually better tenants because some modicum of responsibility occurs there.
Yeah, I almost wonder how many landlords out there just put no pets as like the default. And then if they've got a great tenant and the tenant comes to them and says like, hey, I want to adopt an animal, then like I've heard that sometimes it's a something you can negotiate, but it's pretty hard if you've got a pet as a member of your family to just be knocking on doors and looking for a place to live and being shut out from so many of these available rental units. Yeah,
my friend Michael got really he even said he got really emotional after posting on my wall about it because he says that, and he posted basically saying that this is not a choice for a lot of people, right? Like owning a pet is something that we've been doing for thousands of years. Like having pets in your life, having animals, companion animals is a part of human existence to such a broad subset of our culture and like human civilization that it's like how could we as a society say that those with money can have it and those without money can't?
Yeah, it's true. It's an equality issue.
So currently the landlords are able to restrict the number, size, and type of pets, and this has been applied to me. I have a strict limit of 2 cats and no other animals other than fish for my house, but I can see kind of a logical argument for restricting very large dogs in certain places, and a kind of more of just the heebie-jeebies associated with wanting to restrict the amount of snakes in my immediate vicinity.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
But I think for me it's like you should be able to
snakes,
but you should be able to regulate it in the sense maybe an added damage deposit is something that a landlord can ask for, and I'm perfectly, and every pet owner I know is fine with that. There's still an inequality issue there, but it's much less so. And having limits on size of dog. My building here, the strata, has a limit on the size of dog. It clearly isn't enforced, but there's a limit, and that's reasonable to me. Or numbers of animals. But to say no cats or dogs to me is to say no, you can't live the way basically humans have been living since like 10,000 BC BC or earlier.
It's true. Yeah, and as more and more people move to cities, I think this is going to be more and more of an issue. So it was nice to see somebody kind of calling attention to it, and so there's a petition circulating. Can you still sign that? Do
Yes, petition's still going, and it's getting quite a few signatures actually.
So sign it if you agree. Don't sign it if you don't agree. We'd be interested to hear your reasons why. Moving on, another headline that we saw this week. Ontario has made it illegal to protest outside of abortion clinics, and they've got 8 clinics in the province, and they've created these zones of 50 to 150 meters around abortion clinics where it's now illegal for anybody to intimidate anybody from going inside, and it's also illegal to protest outside of the homes of workers who work in abortion clinics. And what was really interesting to me about this story is that all 3 provincial parties in Ontario worked together on this bill. That was a surprise.
That was a surprise, and I think it showed both Kathleen Wynne's ability to finesse an issue in such a way that it didn't cause a giant blow up in the legislature, and also Patrick Brown's desire to win the next election.
Yes.
Say more.
So Patrick Brown is the Ontario PC leader, and he has a number of members of his caucus who, for completely unrelated reasons, were not in the House that day to vote on this legislation.
My.
So,
including the 19-year-old that they have. That's I assume the one that's extremely anti-trans rights. And he's like 19.
I am all for diversity in our legislatures, but at some point you just have to.
Well, he's pretty diverse by age, but I think that's about the only one.
Yeah, I would much rather have experienced people with a bit of diversity than
But yes, I think that it's long overdue. BC's law has been on the books for over 20 years, and I don't understand why it never happened before in Ontario.
It's really important, in particular, with the workers' homes thing, because harassment and murder of abortion doctors and abortion care providers has been a major policy of some of the most extreme parts of the anti-abortion movement, and they do tend to get targeted, and a lot of that is facilitated by people letting these lone wolves know where the houses are through these protests.
Well, and just people shouldn't have to live in fear of being, yelled at and have eggs thrown at you, let alone the fear for your actual life. You shouldn't have people protest at your home for your perfectly legal job.
That's right. Yeah. Do you think this will hold up against a free speech challenge if the anti-choice movement takes them to? It's
apparently written very closely in line with BC's 20-year-old law, and so the anticipation is that it'll actually be able to hold up fairly well there because the BC law has stood the test of time.
Has the BC law been challenged then?
The one article that I read said that the BC law had been under scrutiny, was I believe the quote. So I don't know if it's actually been challenged in law or what.
Yeah, well, hopefully this improves access to care for women in Ontario. I think it's really notable that all 3 parties work together on this. So
can I just say how wonderful the first section of the Constitution is, the reasonable limits clause, because an unrestricted right to free speech, or an unrestricted right to own firearms. Or an unrestricted right to prevent soldiers from being quartered in your house.
For example.
Yeah. They can lead to these
sometimes quartering soldiers in your homes is a requirement.
Exactly. This is what I tell people all the time.
It comes up frequently at parties.
It would, wouldn't it?
So, first section of the Constitution?
Yeah, so the reasonable limits clause allows the government to establish such reasonable limits on rights as are justified in a free and democratic society. And apparently those reasonable limits are about 150 meters away from an abortion clinic. So there is a zone of safety, and still the right to free speech is preserved. Balancing of rights is important.
Well put.
We agree.
So this week, the new BC government has introduced legislation to take big money out of local government elections by banning corporate and union donations and limiting donations by individuals to $1,200, similar to the new BC election contribution rules. The new rules also ban out-of-province donations, and this is, I'm guessing, in anticipation of the upcoming municipal elections that BC will be holding in November 2018, 1 year from now. What do you guys think?
I think that I got an invite to a emergency last-minute fundraiser last night for the NPA. I wrote one letter to George Affleck like 4 years ago praising him on something, and I've been on their mailing list ever since.
Oh my
Isn't
God.
it great how political parties have been able to write themselves out of the spam rules?
Yeah,
Yes.
that is amazing.
But yes, it's. I think that every political party scrambled before the sunset came in for the new money. But I think this is fantastic. I think that there's no downside to this whatsoever.
Well, it'll certainly make it more work to fundraise for parties. They'll have to get fewer donations from more people, and they'll have to hustle for that.
I think Vision really carried a lot of the heavy legwork on this one to make it happen. Andrea Reimer, when she stepped down last week, even said that she was going to make it her mission in the ensuing time to force the government into doing it. I think that it's I think that there's I know Matthew's getting eager to rebut me, but I think that while there are a lot of criticisms of Vision, and I certainly have my fair share of criticisms of Vision, this is one where they did a lot of work where they didn't frankly have to. They could have sat back and enjoyed a system that they were winning under. They make more money than anybody else has ever made money in civic elections from developers and from other organizations, and they've actively fought to remove that money from the system, and I think I got to respect them for that.
I'm just so happy to hear that Andrea Reimer has accomplished her post-electoral life mission, because now it means she can go away forever. No one has been more uncivil on city council.
I don't think that's at all true.
No one has been more uncivil on city council than the Andrea Reimer who accused some of her political opponents of being murderers for not agreeing with her policies. But I'm going to get back to the topic at hand. I actually think that fundraising is just a miserable and horrible thing to have to do, which is why a lot of political people really like the unlimited
bags of money.
So why not do that again, but just make the money public? I think that BC should strongly consider moving towards a public financing model.
Public is. I think that public is in just it's published.
No, not disclosure.
Oh no, we're both all in on public financing of elections. I think that's a great idea. I do want to say that there is, I think, a process lens to this. Is I kind of wonder, the BC government initially didn't bring it out. They brought it out now, either because they were working on it or they didn't think they necessarily had the political requirement to do it. And over the last month since they brought in the provincial level ban, they either saw the political impetus to act, or they had simply been planning to all along. And we will never know that answer, but it's an interesting question.
I think that politicians have largely been putting their fingers in their ears over this issue and saying, no, it's not an issue. I swear people don't care about it. I swear. And actually they do. No matter how many articles appeared in the New York Times, of all places, about how BC is the Wild West of political fundraising.
Yeah.
BC political issues shouldn't make the New York Times. We should be boring and well-governed enough. We should live up to the peace, order, and good government of our nation's motto.
There was that time that our premier was the Time Person of the Year, though.
Yes.
And they, in fact, called us a backwater, I think, in the article.
For building a dam, interestingly enough.
Foreshadowing.
But when this article was published, I think a lot of people realized, everyone else, despite what we're hearing on the radio, is thinking the same thing that I am, and it became politically unfeasible for any government to do anything else.
So that's interesting. And just as you were saying that, I was thinking, I wonder if the increased global position that BC and Vancouver has had over the last 10 years since the Olympics has also sort of raised that concern that there is money and influence coming here from elsewhere, and it's really shaping the way politics shakes out.
That's a really good point. We are now a huge stop on the globalization superhighway.
Yeah, and I think that Matthew's point there about the New York Times, that New York Times article put the issue into the stratosphere. British Columbians, we get fairly, especially Lower Mainlanders, we tend to be very worried about how others view us. We tend to have that sort of weird Canadian inferiority complex, and so I think the second we were making news in a bad way outside of BC was when we cared so much more than when it was making news inside of BC.
Yeah.
Well, it just wasn't making news inside of BC because
the Tyee was talking about it all the time.
It wasn't making news inside of BC.
I read the tie.
I mean, it was like everybody knew about it, but it was just sort of treated like the status quo, the norm. Like it's never going to change, and it's interesting that it takes an American publication to show us ourselves and let us know that it doesn't necessarily have to be this way.
Yeah,
there was a thing that Hector Bremner said in the interview that I did with him the other day, and if you haven't heard it yet, you should go and listen to last week's episode. But he said Vancouver talks about housing the way the U.S. talks about healthcare, and I feel that was something that British Columbia was doing on the issue of campaign financing, or at the very least, the government was saying we're just not going to talk about it at all. So it's actually even more akin to the gun violence issue in the United States. But it was as if that 76% majority that supports greater gun control was just completely silenced for the 16 years of recent BC Liberal government.
Yeah. Well, and we stuck our heads in the sand on so many things that we could and should have acted on. Whether it was the fixed term lease issue that has now been, that loophole has been fixed, which could have been done at any time. Whether it's the public financing of elections or any number of things, including housing. It seemed like it was like the last 4 years. I don't know if I think that the second Campbell government did a fairly reasonable job of running the province. I think it's mostly the Christy Clark regime that I'll put most of the blame on. I think they just put their heads in the sand.
So do you think this municipal election is going to be markedly different from the last few that we've experienced?
I don't know what the political parties' war chests are like right now.
Well, Vision's got money.
Yeah, I feel like
and they didn't spend any money on the by-election, so they didn't even print signs. No, but I think anything can happen, because I think the voters, too, aren't necessarily going to go with the party that spends the most money. It does help, but I think that Vision is in trouble, and I think that there's a lot of people circling the wagons to try to win the next election.
Who is allowed to donate? Now, this is
British Columbians.
Okay.
So I could donate. So last municipal election, my friend Nathan Pahal was running in Langley City, and I donated money to his campaign. I will do so again, because he's a really great city councilor, and I'm really excited for him to win re-election, hopefully. And I'll be able to. But if Nathan had a friend in Calgary, that Calgary friend wouldn't be able to donate.
But okay, no unions, no corporations, can nonprofits, charities, can we have super PACs? Like, is any of that?
It's the same laws as are applying to the provincial level.
So students who reside in BC but are not BC residents, are they allowed to donate?
It's a good question. I think we'll have to look into it. I think my gut feeling is yes, because they'll be residents of the municipality, but it's a good question.
I think the question basically of
I might have to look into it.
Legislative drafting on this thing.
Yeah, you would think that if you can vote, you should be able to donate.
So why don't we look?
If you can't donate, you shouldn't be able to vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So why don't we look into it and get back to it?
Okay. Well, looking forward to the next election and seeing if there's any positive changes or interesting changes. Let's move on to a larger topic, the BCUC report. Oh, Matthew's got a sad look on his face. The British Columbia Utilities Commission released a report on the Site C Dam, which had been proposed back in 2010. Who remembers the final days of the Gordon Campbell government? I do.
I just think of 3 letters.
H.
That's one of them. Yeah.
T.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, those were interesting times, weren't they? Back in 2010, on I think it was the last day, it might have been in the last week of Premier Gordon Campbell's tenure as Premier, he announced that they would be starting work on the Site C Dam, which had been paused in the 1980s, and that is the dam proposed for the Peace River up in northeastern British Columbia. And so for the last 7 years, BC Hydro and British Columbian government has been working on getting that ready for damming that river and all of the implications that go along with that. They never took the proposal to the BC Utilities Commission, the role of which is to review proposals and make sure that the rates are going to be fair for hydro ratepayers and ICBC ratepayers. So this report, I know you've both read some of it. I only read the article. Anybody want to give us the lowdown?
I can probably do a fairly good job of summarizing it. Is what they determined was they were asked to do 3 things. One, how much would it cost to just cancel the dam? And how much would it cost to delay the dam for a number of years to build it when the power is potentially needed? And how much is it going to cost to finish the dam? As well as some other things around how much it would cost to do the same projects with other energy requirements and things like that. And so what they determined was the middle possibility, the delaying, is basically a non-option. It's several additional $1 billion under the overall cost of the project. There's no real point in delaying. It's either build it or don't build it. And so the build it camp, it's clearly multiple billions of dollars over budget. The initial budget was around $8 billion. It's now BCUC has said it'll come in at well over $10 billion, and they don't believe they actively they and the auditing company Deloitte actively cast aspersions on Hydro's estimates as being not well costed out for what the risk factors were. So it's well over $10 billion is the assumption for completing the dam.
Point of clarification, was it $10 billion is the estimated total cost, or $10 billion
total cost
over
total cost?
the
So she
original
puts it at $2 billion over,
Which is a steal for a mega project.
Anyways, BCUC has said that they're anticipating it coming in between 25 and 50% over budget, which is actually lower over budget than most mega projects. Now, what
I referred to Patrick in our previous mega project episode for that.
In terms of the actual the cost of immediate cancellation, they said immediate cancellation and restoration of the pristine wilderness, whatever, not to whatever that, but restoration of the valley back to its original state would be about $1.8 billion. Now, that does leave the question of meeting energy demands, because without the dam, you don't have the ability to meet the potential increase in energy demands. So what they also said was they took a look at the high load estimate, the medium load estimate, the low load estimate of how much hydro is estimating increase in demand over the next 20 to 30 years, and they also incorporated estimates that hydro had not included, such as electrifying a vast majority of our car fleet, for example, is for personal motor vehicles. And they determined that on a low demand load estimate, it would be, I think it was $3 billion to be able to remit the dam completely, and then add in renewable options that would be able to cover it, along with actual demand management tools such as variable time pricing and things like that would reduce usage, because Vancouver has not seen reductions in usage like other districts because we haven't been using demand management tools to try to increase efficiency. On a high load, that was about $5.5 billion.
Okay, so I have a bit of a different take on this report, because I think that the terms of reference that were given to the BC Utilities Commission based on current load forecasts were, I think, very narrow and designed to achieve a certain result. Nevertheless, I think that the truth does shine through somewhat. Increasingly viable energy sources is the language that the BC Utilities Commission report uses for viable alternative solutions. Increasingly viable is basically a synonym for magical thinking. I am very, very skeptical of the ability of anywhere to be able to produce the same amount of energy for this type of demand. And frankly, it is kind of reprehensible that we are willing to export the environmental damage that we are going to cause by creating a lot of solar panels and a lot of hydrothermal.
There's also environmental damage from building a dam as well. There's substantial concrete costs. There's substantial damage to the environment.
Absolutely.
There's downriver damage that gets done.
There are problems with the dam, and I think that being realistic and honest about them is the best thing that you can do. But the remediation costs are substantial, and you don't have a dam at the end of that. The cancellation and building.
You don't spend $8 billion more.
Yes, but you should spend $8 billion more because then you have a dam.
So the thing is that even if they were to remediate and meet the high load estimate that BC Hydro has put forward, bearing in mind that Hydro has overestimated demand increases 77% of the times that it's made estimates before.
Yes, because people never get better at anything doing it over.
No, and in fact, BCUC, in one of the pages between 100 and 200, I've read about 200 pages of the document, actually goes in and says that the rate at which they're wrong has been increasing over the last decade compared to the decades before that. And so if you go into the actual document, it actually shows where they get their estimates for things like the renewables that you're talking about and where they're getting those numbers. They've taken in quite a bit more than BC Hydro has in terms of the increased demand load as well.
Would you be able to define the term industrial curtailment for me?
Yes, I have it right here. Includes paying industrial and commercial customers to monitor and lower their usage during peak events. And so what that does is that encourages the reduction, because the problem with any kind of electrical system is your peak demand period. So, 7 in the morning when everyone's having showers, 6 p.m. when everyone's watching TV. So that kind of a thing. Similarly to when industrial companies are using their highest demand load, is what you do is you create a system of carrots and sticks to attempt to ensure that companies are spacing out their demand load over a wider period of time. And most of the rest of the industrial industries of North America have been living in regimes where they've been forced to do this, and so they're seeing reductions in usage substantially, which means that you don't have that high peak capacity. If we're only creating demand for the medium capacity, we don't need the dam at all. We almost don't need anything else that we would ever need to build, because we're building for the maximum capacity that the system can use, so that we avoid brownouts and things like that.
I think a helpful analogy here is, say you're opening a store. Do you build enough parking spaces for Christmas shopping season, or do you build enough parking spaces for an average day, and then you encourage people during Christmas shopping season to maybe shop at different hours? Maybe you encourage them to shop
build
online.
no parking spaces and build a train. But,
That's the key thing.
You modify the behavior so that you don't have to oversupply during the rest of the year or the rest of the day.
Well, I grew up in Calgary, which has embraced the let's aim for the peak model of parking, and it has created a very poorly planned city. I think that trying to get people to shop for Christmas in July might be a bit of a wrong-headed thing to try and do, especially when we have a challenge that is coming in the next 100 years, the for lack of a better word, climate apocalypse, that is going to cause some very substantial changes to our society.
Yep.
And I feel that there is nothing in this report that I have read that has, they have, in fairness, incorporated the electrification of cars into this report, but there is nothing in terms of the long-term thinking, in terms of the requirements for a sustainable and stable power system that actually
that is in there. That's if I recall correctly, on page 220-ish. I have to pull it up, but I did find significant chapters on preparation for climate change, including the needs for additional power consumption during things like heat waves and whatnot, and that's all in there.
See, and that is such a great example of how we are underestimating this problem, because it's not going to be a heat waves issue. We're going to have a much larger population issue because there's many fewer places to live in the world.
Very likely. But that doesn't change the fact that alternative methods of power generation are substantially cheaper than Site C dam.
Well, cheaper to whom? We can buy rare earth minerals, rare earth elements from other places.
I would really like to see the analysis that says that a $10 billion mega dam, where you divert rivers, where you put in hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete, where you do all of that, is substantially less greenhouse gas emissions than the life cycle of similar solar voltaic cells built in 2017.
Yeah, and that's fine.
Because I haven't seen that analysis before.
Yeah, but Love Canal didn't emit a lot of greenhouse gases. It was poison. These mines are poison, and we're going to have to start mining them in the Canadian Shield soon enough when we get our assaying up to snuff there. But those problems are first being exported to the developing world, which is immoral, and second, will eventually happen here. So we have choices to make.
Yeah, we certainly do. And I mean, as a ratepayer, it's interesting to think of myself as a very tiny shareholder in the great crown corporation of BC Hydro, and thinking about this as a collective. Do we need this big project? Is it worth investing in this project, or should we go invest in other projects, or should we tighten our belts and use less energy and look for efficiencies so that we don't need to expand our capacity? These are all really, really difficult choices, and one of the factors that we haven't really talked about yet, but I think it is much more top of mind during this dam talk than in previous dam debates is the issue of First Nations territory, and the other two major dam projects that we have in British Columbia displaced First Nations peoples. It flooded their communities, made their traditional territories and hunting ground inaccessible to them, and the same would be true for this dam. And there are First Nations that have been blocking this project or attempting to block project for the last 7 years. And so I wonder if this new government is committed to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are they going to be able to move forward with this project?
There is everything you said is absolutely accurate, and somewhat annoyingly, the Supreme Court has said that every project needs to be evaluated on its own merits at the Supreme Court level or at the highest level of court that it can get to in the appeals process, which is dumb, and there needs to be a test established eventually for whether or not the duty to consult has been fulfilled.
But UNDRIP isn't duty to consult. UNDRIP is duty to obtain consent, informed consent. You know, you're talking about the law in Canada. We're talking about the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which requires, if we're going to sign on to it, informed consent of the Indigenous peoples of the area. Now, it is interesting, though, and I think this is a complication, is that there are Indigenous bands for whom that land is theirs and they support the dam, and there are Indigenous groups for whom that land is theirs and they don't support the dam, they oppose the dam, and that becomes that UNDRIP is very complicated, and it's going to be messy when as we embrace it.
So there is, while international conventions can be kind of anticipatorily imported into Canadian law, there is already some jurisprudence on the issue that says that there is no absolute veto on development projects by First Nations, and I think that having an absolute veto, unless that there is some more ordered form of like regional representative democracy, like a council of chiefs for a region, or
Can I ask, why is it that if all the bands, let's say this isn't the case here, if all the bands opposed the dam, why would they not have a veto, or why should they not have a veto? Not in law, but in what is right.
I'm sorry, not in law. The law is itself like a good thing to uphold.
But the law said that you couldn't get married 10 years ago.
Yes, and
that was wrong.
Yes, and I worked to change it through the process that was established. So if the law is wrong, then it should be changed. But like I am speaking to the law as it stands right now, and I think that like the coming climate apocalypse is going to require quite a bit of land, if nothing else, for people to live on.
Okay, so here's my question. How would damming a giant river and watershed and disrupting that ecosystem be good for climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts?
We need power, and so the most recent estimate of the full energy usage in British Columbia of all forms of energy, and that includes concrete and petroleum and natural gas, is about 380 petajoules, and that is about 21% provided by electricity. There is no report, including some that were produced for this particular issue, that would even have us coming close to meeting our Paris Agreement climate goals in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases unless we have much more power. And that includes the BC Utilities Commission report, because they have been drawing off of the reports that are already extant on the subject.
What I don't like about that petajoule argument is that it's telling me that 1 ounce of electrical energy is just as efficient as 1 ounce, or 1 joule of electrical energy is just as efficient as 1 joule of gasoline burned, which is not true, because when you burn gasoline, there's all sorts of inefficiencies in that process. They have heat exhaust, they have all sorts of things that don't, and so that number feels to me to be inflated. And now I would want to see more data on that, but that number has always bothered me because electric cars are highly efficient in terms of the amount of energy they consume. The amount of energy that an internal combustion car consumes is very, very inefficient.
So Matthew, are you saying that that we need to have BC Hydro Dam because if people weren't using the energy that they got from Site C, they would be using that energy and burning fossil fuels as an alternative? They would be doing that otherwise.
Basically, yes. You asked 3 questions earlier. One was, should we build this project? Should we find other ways to meet these energy needs? And should we tighten our belts, basically? And the answer to all 3 of those questions is yes, a lot. At least in my mind.
Okay.
The other important thing to remember, because this project is in BC, is that this is one of the rare parts of BC that is covered by a treaty. And a fairly uncharitable reading of Treaty 8 has public infrastructure projects written into it. Projects for the public good, I think, is what the actual language is. But there is like a legal framework within this there is a legal framework within which this project conflict does exist.
I get the legal, but I think that there's a moral.
Yeah, there's 5,500 hectares of river valley that would be flooded, and that's land that is being used right now by farmers and by wildlife and by different ecosystems and First Nations and residents, and their entire way of life is going to be dramatically changed.
Though it should be noted, because that number is big and should be put into context, that a lot of that land is riparian slope or
Wetland.
in river island.
Places where there's lots of land.
No, riparian slope is just the river valley sides.
And it is true, too, that BCUC report did essentially reject a lot of the arguments around the loss of agricultural land. They said that there's not a lot of intense use of agricultural land there now, and that this would not reduce a large percentage of the agricultural land capacity of the Peace Valley there. So while I tend to think that as climate change changes things in the Peace Valley becomes...
Could have got a ton more arable land.
And the Peace Valley becomes much more arable as the growing season grows. The BCUC report did indicate that they would still be able to have considerable agricultural capacity there, even with the dam. So, like, credit where it's due is that is the agricultural argument of the million people fed, BCUC largely waved away.
Interesting. So I have one last question for you about the report. So the BC Liberals have been pushing this project forward for the last 7 years. They did not go to the BCUC like they might have done for other projects. The NDP's line for the last 7 years has been take this project to the BCUC, and they did that as an election promise. They did not promise to cancel the project.
True.
Importantly. So, do you think this report was worthwhile? Do you think it helped us as ratepayers? Do you think it helped us as residents of this province to know whether this project is viable, important, worthwhile?
If this report provides the NDP with the political cover to save 2,200 well-paying, union, family-supporting jobs and provide us with low-cost, sustainable, renewable power for a generation and more, yes, this report was worth every penny. If the NDP does a dumb thing and fires all those people and, like, creates a situation in which we have, theoretically, an energy deficit going into the future, according to some reports, then we have a problem. And no, it wasn't.
So Minister Mungall has said that she's going to take it to the cabinet to decide as a whole, because this is too large of an issue for one cabinet minister to decide. It'll be interesting to see where it goes. The Greens have already said that this was the final nail in the coffin, as Andrew Weaver said, for Site C. And I think there is an easy read there that BCUC lays out a statement that this is highly risky energy that we may not need, that there may not be a market to sell it anywhere, and that the options for renewables are actually cheaper to produce the same amount of energy, and that they are on a load capacity that can match us what we need when we need it. So all that being said, there are benefits, and Matthew points them out, is that if there is a market for energy in North America, which the report says is a medium, moderate risk, because it may not happen, then we can sell this. Now, we have been fairly unsuccessful at selling energy as a province in the past, and so I don't necessarily think that, past practices don't always predict future performance.
It's not like a neighboring province has made a commitment to get off coal power or anything.
Yeah, but they're also going to get off coal power in their own way, too, through things like
buying our energy.
Possibly
at a discounted price, because that's what the market will bear.
Where we won't be able to sell it for anywhere near the cost that we build the dam at. So
it is
I think that there is an argument to keep building the dam in this report. I don't think it's a good argument, but the report doesn't completely damn the dam. I've been waiting all podcasts to say that, by the way.
This project is great. This report is great because it's like the Bible. You can just take whatever view you already have, project it onto the report, and there it is, justified.
Can we just note that you're a practicing Catholic? That was an odd way to describe the Bible.
Sure, fine. Okay, fair enough.
Okay.
I don't read the Bible, though. I'm Catholic. I let the priests read it for me. And then they explain it to me.
Like journalists?
But
like us.
Yes, journalists for God and us.
I will say the BCUC report, there's two components to it. The executive summary.
For God.
The executive summary is 20 pages long and is full of infographics and is quite digestible. I recommend people go and read it. The 300-page report is not as digestible. Not just because it's 300 pages. I've burned through a fair number of it. It's not an easy read, but I would recommend everybody go out and read the executive report because this is one of the biggest projects potentially to either happen or be canceled in our province.
We all have a stake in this because if you want to be able to have energy in your home, you're going to have to pay for it. And if this project costs the system a lot of money, that means your rates are going to go up. But if we don't have enough supply, your rates might also go up. So if you're concerned about your rates, if you're concerned about other things that may be impacted here, the 2,000 jobs that Matthew mentioned, or the First Nations treaty rights, or the fish, or the caribou, it's important to get involved and take a look at that report and have an opinion on this issue. It's a really big one for our province. Okay, let's pause.
Two yellows. Two yellows.
Two
I had
yellows.
4 yellows in my breakfast this morning. They were yolk.
Soccer's a beautiful game. I believe it's referred to as the beautiful game. I'm just going to say it.
Yes, but it's not referred to as soccer in most places. I think that's an abomination.
Historically, the earliest definition of the sport was actually called soccer in the UK.
I don't care.
And then soccer fell out of usage for the word football. And soccer is, in fact, an older term.
Isn't soccer an abbreviation for association foot? Isn't soccer derived from the sock in association?
Some form of
association football. There's no way the first reference to the sport was an association sport. There had to be football in there somewhere.
There's like a historiography thing. I've read it. It's a bit written by a North American, obviously.
Sports ball.
It's boring.
Let's talk about a different football. A political football. Called NAFTA. Okay, our next segment is about the NAFTA modernization efforts taking place right now between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. If you are Canadian, you are probably hearing a lot about this every day, every time you turn on any kind of media outlet. I suspect the same is true as if you are Mexican. I don't know that Americans are hearing a lot about this issue.
I don't know that certain Americans are hearing a lot about this issue because I think one of the biggest obstacles to, truth and reason, our friends in this, is that the facts are not able to get out to large segments of the American population that are the most opposed to NAFTA. They are being fed a certain amount of propaganda by angry billionaires, basically.
Men of the people, I think, right? That hair, it looks like everyone else's hair.
So, the North America Free Trade Agreement. Who wants to give us a little background?
In the time of Brian Mulroney, when all of us were but glimmers in our parents' eye, there was a negotiation on a Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. There was an earlier one back in about 1906 called Reciprocity that the Liberals were in favor of.
We all learned about that one in school.
Yes. Many years later, the parties had switched positions, and the Conservatives were the ones... the Progressive Conservatives were the ones in favor of free trade, and the Liberals were against it. And they had a very good election ad where the border between the United States and Canada was being erased.
It's a great ad.
It's a really, really good ad.
One of the best political ads.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah.
So Mulroney ran on that.
Yes. So the 1988 federal election was basically run on CUSFTA, which is not a good acronym. But
what does it stand for?
The Canada-US Free Trade Agreement.
Okay.
But
it was called the FTA at the time.
Yes.
Yeah, there were buttons made with FTA with that hash through it. Yeah.
That out aside, and the Liberals were reduced to one of their lowest seat titles ever.
Just erasing the mid-2000s.
I have blacked out many of those times.
Literally, actually.
But that agreement was made by Brian Mulroney. He took it to the Senate and was unable to get it through the Senate because of more high Toryist opposition from within his own party and a glut of Liberal senators that Pierre Trudeau and John Turner had appointed on the way out. He appointed a bunch more senators but couldn't get it through the Senate anyway. After the election, after the consent of the people had been obtained, it passed through through. This agreement was eventually expanded to include Mexico in 1993, and the Liberals, having somewhat come around to the idea, implemented it splendiferously, and basically we are now living in that world.
Well, and I think the Mexico part is really fascinating because we added Mexico not for any economic advantage. Mexico was added because Mexico was effectively a failed state at the time, and was continuing to spiral into violence. And having that on the border of your continent is really damaging for a lot of things. And so we added Mexico because there was the belief at the time, and it still holds true in some circles, that free trade lifts all boats. The rising tide lifts all boats. And so this idea was that if you bring them into the free trade agreement, companies will relocate there. They'll create the special economic zones, which will allow companies to move in there, and it'll build Mexico back up again. Now, I mean, people always argue about whether or not these things worked, but I mean, Mexico, despite its problems now, and it has them, is nowhere near the problematic and failed state that it was in 93. And so I think that you could say that it has had a significant positive effect on making Mexico less of a lawless wasteland.
And in fairness, the extent to which there is major organized crime in Mexico is in large part a result of U.S. policy,
yes,
like the horrifying drug war as well.
Mm-hmm.
So for the last 20, 30 years, we've all been living under this agreement where we try to reduce or make it more free for humans and goods and capital to move across borders without having to pay tariffs. And this went along with a lot of other kinds of negotiations around labor rules and dispute negotiation. And we've all kind of like been living with this situation that was negotiated in the 80s. But the world is very different now. There's a lot of good things that could come out of this modernization. But it was all started because President Trump put it into his election campaign, calling NAFTA one of the worst things that has ever happened to the United States and threatening to tear up the whole agreement altogether. And since then, his approach to this negotiation has been pretty, I don't know, what would you say, hostile?
Haphazard?
Horrifying?
Well, I think it's
unpredictable?
It's something that's put the
half-baked?
half-baked, haphazard.
He doesn't understand
He doesn't
NAFTA.
know what he's trying to cancel. He just knows that the coal miners in Pennsylvania really hate it.
He gripes about milk, and believe me, we can and
We can and should go into that.
we can and should go into in a future episode our supply management system. But our agriculture sectors are not broadly included in NAFTA.
Yep.
So
Same with softwood lumber.
like this is absolutely insane. There is a trade deficit with the United States right now, and trade deficit means that we export less than we buy from the United States, which seems to be the scorecard that Donald Trump is using to adjudicate whether or not the U.S. is winning, in air quotes.
So the fear is that he's going to unilaterally cancel NAFTA.
Yes, which would be bad for about 1 in 5 Canadian jobs, which depend on the trade agreement.
And probably a similar or greater number of American jobs. It's not just the states that border Canada, it's the states that border Mexico, it's the states that don't border either of them and just sell to both of us.
I think it was something like 38, I can't be that specific. I'm just going to say 40 states, to the nearest 10, have the largest single trading partner for all of them is Canada. It is a huge number of jobs and dollars that are dependent on our trade relationship. $1 billion a day across one bridge. It's the most integrated economies in the world.
Yeah. I mean, just last week or just this week, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest lobbying group in America, they have the most clout in any lobbying group in America, came out and said that protecting NAFTA is their number one goal, and they're going to be opening the floodgates to make that happen. And they have a really well-located headquarters. Their headquarters is a very large marble building across from a very large White House, and so they're a very politically and strategically situated organization, and so Canada's got a lot of allies in the United States in this fight.
You mentioned the trade deficit thing, and I also was wondering about that because I know countries were worried about trade deficits when they used the gold standard and they were afraid they weren't going to have enough gold as the other countries, but we're not we're mercantilists anymore. Why is he worried about trade deficits? Why does that impact the United States?
It doesn't. It's not like the U.S.'s prosperity depends on them having a trade deficit with the rest of the world, because they are able to buy a lot of like low-cost goods and have a lot of low-cost goods, and still generate a lot of product like movies and culture and doomahickeys that they can export to the rest of the world at a rate that is like slightly lower than the total sum of things that they import. It's complicated, but basically having a trade deficit, a slight one, having a serious trade deficit is a problem, but having a slight trade deficit could mean that you are in the prime position for economic growth.
Is there a problem? No. Oh, do you need to go?
No, I was just pointing out that the U.S. has a trade deficit with Canada.
What?
Yes, it's a $12 billion trade deficit.
I am quoting Chrystia Freeland on this. That is my source.
As in
US
Canada
website.
exports more to the U.S. than the U.S. exports to Canada.
$12 billion?
That's what you said, isn't it?
It's effectively the same.
That's like nothing. This is no money at all in like the grand scheme of both of our economies.
$266 billion exported to Canada and $278 billion imported from Canada.
I will point out,
slight, right?
Yeah, it's almost nothing.
I will point out that is not the figure that the Canadian government is using.
The Canadian government is talking, if I recall correctly, the Canadian government talks about how we have a trade deficit with them on a number of things that are economic generators, and so we're selling them a lot of things that are economic generators. We're selling them raw materials to build construction. We're selling them energy, or we're selling them oil and gas to build to develop their economy. And so we have a significant trade deficit there, and they have a trade surplus in the sense that they're bringing in they're bringing in more, I think it is, things that multiply the economy, if I recall correctly.
So on the table, oh sorry, did you want to?
I'll just point out that $12 billion is such a small percentage of our.
It's it's like one dam.
Oh, just exactly. I agree with you.
Okay.
It is such a small percentage of both of our economies that like differences in the formula for calculation can flip the issue.
Yeah.
Both countries are working off the same set of facts, and both countries might very well be right. But that's not how you should calculate whether or not you're winning from a trade agreement, as if zero-sum wins are like the essence of international trade as opposed to making the lives of your people better. But whatever.
So some of the other demands, in addition to the trade deficit concern, is President Trump is demanding that all cars need 50% U.S. content to avoid a tariff. He wants to gut the enforcement systems for Chapter 11, 19, and 20 to make them non-binding or voluntary. He wants to make the Buy American program able to block other countries' access to U.S. government procurement.
And the 50% car part rule, sorry.
Yeah. Well, there's one more, but let's talk about the cars, and then I'll talk about the next one.
The 50% car part deal, the analysis that I've sort of heard from people is that would basically destroy the Canadian auto industry, because you would then produce the other 50% of your parts and whatnot in Indonesia and other places that have bargaining car market manufacturers that don't have the various labor rights that we do, and they'll just soak up the tariff at that point, because there's no point in them doing that basket of goods back and forth with that currently exists.
One of my favorite stats on the Canada-US trade relationship is the number one thing that Canada sells to the US is cars, and the number one thing that Canada buys from the US is cars.
Yep.
And that is because we make each other's cars, and we make different cars for each other.
We also make a pile of their car parts, too.
Basically, I'm just screaming at the president, you do not understand the economy. You don't understand where things are getting made. Building a new plant would be a bad idea.
So there's one more thing that I wanted to mention that may upset you even more, it might not. The veto on Canadian milk classification decisions.
It's not part of the agreement!
I think that at the end of the day, though, I don't think that Trump has the ability to truly void NAFTA. There are steps that the U.S. Senate can do, and probably would do if Trump attempted to invoke the article that is the cancellation article. And I think that they would protect against that, because I think that there are too many senators from states whose number one trading partner is Canada.
There is like in the negotiations between Lighthizer and Freeland, Lighthizer is the U.S. trade representative for this issue, and Chrystia Freeland is the Canadian Foreign Minister. She has been the point person for the government on this file. The U.S. has essentially asked for concessions with nothing in return, and Canada has asked for improved environmental standards, improved labor rights, a broader costing of what is entailed in the supply chain for any particular good. There is no give and take in this relationship, and so I think the chilling thing that I heard in the most recent interview that I watched of hers is Canada must always be ready to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I don't know what our economies would look like after a NAFTA cessation, but I think it would be very, very bad.
It's a huge issue, and a really good opportunity for all Canadians to learn about the role that trade plays in our politics. Any final thoughts? Do you think reading The Art of the Deal will give you any insight into where this negotiation could go?
No, because he didn't write it.
Okay.
There's the one other element is that he wants the NAFTA to be has forcibly renewed every 5 years rather than an in perpetuity agreement, which basically what company would ever invest cross-border with if the agreement is going to possibly end in 2 to 3 years? Yeah,
do you set up a factory if the agreement could go bust in 5 years?
Yeah, and so I think the in perpetuity clause for this kind of an open borders is almost a requirement, but I also think that Canada's position on labor requirements is also a requirement, because I think free trade from a lefty perspective only really works when the two countries have similar labor laws.
And that is the fairest criticism of the original agreement.
Yeah, it didn't contain any of that.
Right.
And so I think Canada's got the right arguments, but I think that they all step on states' rights, and so the federal government can't do it. But also this administration isn't really interested in these things.
in the White House that...
No, the right to work states, of which a majority of U.S. states, I believe now are, would be wildly opposed to it, because the right to work states don't believe in unionization, because they've gone back to the 1930s in some ways.
What a brilliant and golden age for America that was.
Well, this issue is not going away, but we gotta leave it here. Yes. The goal here is to get this NAFTA modernization finished before the congressional elections. Do you think that's gonna happen? Because I really don't.
Well, no. And the goal, I think, is to get the podcast finished before Patrick throttles us all and turns on the television to watch the soccer game. So
soccer is happening. So
what else to think about?
What am I thinking about? I just got back from an awesome conference in Toronto about transportation demand management, and it was just a really wonderful experience to meet my people and talk about bike lanes and walking school buses and all the things that I love to nerd out about. So that's my thing.
I just got back from a trip as well, and I hiked around Emerald Lake, which is a glacial moraine dam lake that will eventually disappear, but is at the moment outstandingly beautiful because of the pulverized rock which is suspended in the water. Go and hike it yourself. Yo-ho.
I'm about to run to St. Augustine's to watch the second half of the Whitecaps Sounders playoff soccer match, and I think it's a testament to how much I love this podcast and love our listeners that I've managed to miss the entire first half just so I can be here.
A true sacrifice.
Goodbye.
Well, thanks for listening. We are Pod Keep Our Land. I'm Erin.
I'm Matthew.
And I'm Patrick.
You can find us on the social media. Be sure to follow us and comment and let us know if you like this episode. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Okay.
Go.
I'm out.